Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jackie Butler. I am with the MCA Foundation and also with Bio Paso-Juarez. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for what most of us is our lunch hour here in El Paso. I'm very, very excited to introduce the Grant Thornton team that will be discussing with us their Respond and Restore framework for the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to start off by thanking all of the Bio Paso-Juarez members who are on the line, as well as community leaders who are joining us today for this important discussion. You all are in listening mode, so you are muted, but we welcome your participation through questions. If you have a question or a comment, if you can please utilize the chat box that's on your screens, and we will be sure to address any comments or questions you might have at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Pat Schaefer, who is the Managing Director of Regulatory Risk and Quality Effectiveness with Grant Thornton. Pat has an extensive career leading strategic and tactical projects, including global roadmaps, launch readiness assessments, quality, regulatory, clinical, and pharmacovigilance capability maturity assessments, as well as knowledge management and performance measurement initiatives. Pat has been working with the FDA through their Case for Quality program for the last several years, and has also been very close to us here at the MCA and Bio Paso-Juarez as a consultant through various projects over the last year and a half or so. He's actually been to El Paso on numerous occasions over the last year and is a very close friend to us. So I'd like to thank Pat for joining us and go ahead and turn it over to him and his team to proceed with the presentation. Thank you, Pat.
And thank you, Jackie, and thanks for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be addressing all of you today. The team that's going to be addressing the content are going to be Yvette Connor, Andy Makovich, Lisa Walkish, and myself. And I'm going to allow them, starting with Yvette, to introduce themselves, and then we'll move on.
Thanks,
Yvette?
Pat. Thanks, Pat. Good afternoon, everyone. By way of introduction, Yvette Connor, and I am involved in our risk management practice. We have a substantial risk advisory team here at Grant Thornton, working globally, and I lead the enterprise risk management portion of that team. And we'll be talking today about some of our pandemic models and partnerships that we have with public health entities actually around the world, as well as how we're thinking about what this risk is, the impacts in local communities, and ultimately the impacts to business. And so we'll take you on that journey today, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Andy? Andy, we don't hear you. Lisa, maybe you should go.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Walkish, and I lead the life sciences industry team here at Grant Thornton. I've consulted in the industry for over 20 years in a number of different areas, and I work very closely with Pat in our regulatory and compliance team, and I've been working very closely with Yvette as we develop our points of view, tools, and information in response to the COVID-19 situation. So thank you for having us.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And it looks like Andy's microphone isn't enabled, so hopefully during the course of the presentation, he'll be able to come on. I guess first of all, I wanted to make sure and hope all of you on the call are healthy today and doing well considering the virus. Before I turn it over to Yvette to get started in terms of the Respond and Restore, I thought it would be helpful to give a brief update on what's going out there in terms of life sciences and dealing with the coronavirus. what we find very interesting in working with the authorities and working with our clients is that there's obviously a tremendous amount of activity. We gave this presentation up in Massachusetts a week and a half ago on the 22nd of April. And at that time, there was a flurry of emergency use authorizations. Within the last 2 weeks, or less than 2 weeks, there have been 24 additional authorizations for various types of in vitro diagnostics or other types of testing, increase in the number of ventilators and other medical devices to support treatment of patients. And interestingly, 2 authorizations for therapeutics to actually treat the symptoms. So there has been some progress there. As of yet, there are no vaccines that have been authorized, but 2 that I know of, and there may be more, are now in their first in human studies to test the vaccines. One's UK based, and the other one's US based trials that have already begun. What's interesting, the number of authorizations during this pandemic versus authorizations previous, the last one prior to this was for the Zika virus back in 2016. And you can see some of the others there. So this is unprecedented activity on the part of the FDA and other health authorities to enable access to treatment, whether it's protective equipment and medical devices, or whether it's therapeutics and vaccines. So everyone has really responded to the call to action. It also has represented, I don't know if we want to call it opportunity, but a lot of activity for certain manufacturers to step up and create solutions. What we're finding, though, is that many of the manufacturers who are jumping into this aren't necessarily doing it to make a profit. A lot of the equipment has been donated. So, you know, again, great to see such an enthusiastic response. What we have seen with some of our larger medical device clients is that some of the manufacturing related to addressing the crisis, the pandemic, has increased. They're going into additional shifts, and manufacturing is not slowing down for those devices and for those therapeutics. On the other hand, the non-shop floor workforce, very hard, especially the regulatory teams, to apply for those emergency use authorizations, and also to apply for deviations to protocols, because the pandemic has had a tremendous disruptive influence on clinical trials. It could mean, without those deviations to protocols, that a lot of the programs would have to be delayed or even abandoned. So that regulatory activity is really critical. But they're all, at least our client base, they're all sheltering in place and working from their homes. What we've also seen is that even those companies that are engaged in the response to the pandemic, despite the lift in terms of activity and potentially revenue, many of these same companies are seeing significant revenue loss. One company, without naming names, is manufacturing ventilators, and that part of their business has grown substantially, but they still have a 60% drop in revenue, US-based revenue over the last few months. So it's been quite a hit even to those companies that are busy. There is news today. The American Hospital Association reports that the pandemic could cost hospitals as much as $202 billion in losses for hospitals and health systems through the end of June. So despite the increased activity, again, the likelihood of collecting and you know, turning that into profit is not there. That people are responding and providing therapy despite the losses. They're doing what they can. The other thing that was released today, CNBC reported or referenced a report from the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where the lead author indicated that the virus has mutated from its original form. People are now talking about the European version virus versus the Asian version. I think that based on what I've heard, the vaccines that are currently under development are addressing that mutation. But Betty Korber from Los Angeles National Laboratory did indicate that future mutations could limit the effectiveness of those vaccines currently under the study. So what this means is the threat is out there, the risk is real, the impact is already measurable and severe. But despite all of the heroic efforts on the part of the life sciences industry and the health authorities and the hospitals to address the situation. So with that little bit of background, I'm going to turn it over to Yvette and let you talk about the risk model.
Thanks. You're supposed to kick it off with good news, not mutation news. But we are facing some stark realities, and let's talk about them today with a fair amount of acknowledgement, with as much transparency as possible, and then let's begin to explore how we might best respond. So I think by this point, most of us are, number one, familiar with the term pandemic. Number two, understand this is something that spans over time. And number three, that we're at a level 6 pandemic rating scale as assigned by the WHO. Just some factual elements of where we've been actually for a while. The graph in front of you, what you're going to see is the nature of a pandemic as a risk. And unlike other risks that happen and are done in a short period of time, think of a flood, think of a tornado, think of an earthquake, right? With the exception of famine, which can be a much longer event, but also controlled very differently, a pandemic is fundamentally about phases. It's about spread, transmission, and phases. So what you see on the screen in front of you is the pandemic evolving into a pandemic, getting to a we are here level 6, and then we start to climb the European and US-based mountains where the virus is spreading across states, moving from the European region over, spreading across states, then going to counties, then going to cities. And all of that is about people, right? All of that is about people. So we refer to these waves. And then the more interesting part of this perhaps is not the peaks and valleys that we are experiencing and have experienced along the way, and then the peaks and valleys in the individualized states, but really beneath this graph, you'll see 3 horizontal bars. One is reduce. This deals with the whole idea of risk management. Risk management is about reducing your exposure to risk. And there's a whole bunch of ways that ideally we could have done that before the pandemic, but that doesn't matter now. What matters now is what do we do from this point forward? That's the response. The response goes to the heart of business continuity and then crisis management. And most folks today have activated business continuity plans and are running crisis management teams, i.e. the COVID task force that you might have at your organization, or that we've seen at various levels of government. So as we go through the crisis management phase, at some point, we tilt to recovery. So we go from respond to recovery. Now that tilt is not predefined. That pivot point is not predefined, but we're sensing for it. We're looking at, are certain infection rates decreasing? Is hospital capacity increasing? Do we have less folks on ventilators? Things like that, right? We have these sort of tipping points that begin to provide guidance to local public health and government entities around a state, county, or city reopening. Not an easy task to figure out, and we're going to highlight how businesses have been thinking about it, and certainly how some of our not-for-profits and government entities have also been thinking about it. But the object of the exercise of all of this is to get to restoration, to get back to an existing state of operations satisfactorily. Now, that doesn't mean identically. It means satisfactorily, because the new normal, as we call it, will probably be different from the old. And we're seeing that very heavily in business, whereby organizations are really thinking about staffing models, because this has been one of the largest human resource experiments in the history of modern civilization corporate performance, which is an ability of a workforce to essentially shelter in place and work from home. So as the result of that, there has been a boatload of learning that has driven forward a level of confidence in doing something either slightly or perhaps radically different when it comes to how people work. So that's going to be important when we talk about resiliency. And with that, let's go to the next slide and begin to dig in. The object of this is to get to that recovery, which means we want to stay on the topmost trajectory of this graphic. It's shown in purple if you can see colors. If not, it's the topmost line. You'll see as you go through the 4 bubbles at the top that number 3 is where we're at in terms of that crisis management I was referencing. And then we sort of slingshot out, or roller coaster up, if you will, into stabilization and growth. So we go through the dip and up into the rise. What we want to mitigate is the likelihood that we drop below the top line. We want to avoid being a hope and respond strategy, or react and reduce strategy, or even worse, a reduce and wait. Let's just cut expenses and wait this out, right? What we instead want to do is be very strategic in where we focus time and effort to be efficient, not only on a cost basis, but on just a general resource basis, and to prioritize our efforts with an understanding of the risk involved with those particular efforts. And to that tune, let's go to the next slide and go a little bit deeper into how we might approach that. So the challenge with solving for any sort of risk when you're staring down the barrel at it, which we are in this instance, right, is you have to size up the enemy. And in this instance, the enemy is large. When you think about catastrophe, and I mentioned earlier flood, tornado, I did not mention hurricane, I'll mention that now, earthquake, etc. Those things can be large and very damaging, right? They can certainly take lives, and they can certainly do extensive property damage. And yet, the catastrophe of a pandemic on the curve in front of you sits far to the left, only 1 notch above a nuclear disaster. Why? Because of the duration and timeline risk, because of the peaks and valleys that I showed you earlier. And in the instance of COVID-19, because of the ease of transmission and the rate of infection and the need for critical services beyond other current, if you will, RNA viruses. And more importantly, what makes it a pandemic, and I failed to say this earlier, let me say it now, is it's novel. The whole word novel matters. And as you've probably read by now, none of us had immunity to this before it showed up. That's what makes it novel. So it takes time to work through the entirety of the world, which is what makes it so incredibly massive in terms of its net impact to that same world of humans. So the object here, as we think about getting to recovery, as we think about stabilization and growth, and as we think about resiliency, is to push on this curve from the negative. You see a little red negative sign here. We want to try to push COVID to the right, right? We want to try to figure out how to move this more so to the positive, less so to the negative. And that's going to go back to my prior comments around what should we do in terms of order, right? Prioritization, in terms of understanding net impact across a couple of dimensions, people, safety being one, certainly dollars being another, and understanding the variables that might be continuing to evolve as we're trying to make these decisions. Again, it's what makes a pandemic tough. So with that, we'll begin to organize our thoughts into a way to attack that business problem. Next slide, please. There are a lot of variables that I've just covered. So let's keep it simple. Let's boil it down to 4. That if you had to roam the halls of your organization, you need to use 4 talking points. What is the impact to cash? Do we fully understand the impact to cash? And how much cash do we have? And we call that liquidity and cash flow management. 2, will there be a reduced demand for our services? And how are we thinking about that and sizing that up post-COVID-19, right? For your reopen and your, if you will, operational transformation post-COVID. What does your demand look like? 2, in order for you to do your business, your job, to deliver your goods and services, to take care of people, whatever it is, how are you going to go about doing that in a post-COVID-19 situation, environment, right? And these two are related because how you choose to go about doing your job is probably going to be driven by demand. So you have to understand those two things together. There's also some external factors you're going to want to talk about as your third talking point. First and foremost in external factors these are things you do not control. You absolutely have no control over these. What's one of them? What the US government is doing to help you. You don't control it, you're a recipient of it. So what that means is that if you're in the Payment Protection Act, or if you're going to go after the FFCRA tax credits for employee retention, which Andy will talk to in a minute, those are all things that are positive cash flow items that are being made available to you potentially for use. So that's an external factor that's a good one. But what's a bad one? Who says a pandemic is going to be the only thing to happen between now and December as you perhaps wrap your fiscal year? Let's go back to hurricane season. I mean, they're predicting, unfortunately, a rough hurricane season. So for Gulf Coast states, not great news. They're also predicting a bad flood season in the Midwest. Not great news. So you can't become myopic in thinking about your resiliency. Do not lose sight of the fact that this may not be the only negative event to happen in 2020. That means you still have to have an awareness of these other items in your organization as you think about cash, as you think about supply and demand, as you think about the money you might be requesting from the US government through SBA, PPP, or other, and then ultimately looking to your fiscal year end, or perhaps many of our clients are into 2021, 2022. All of that makes your answers better. You don't need to overthink it though. This is just the big stuff. Lastly, people and labor. What makes a pandemic unique is it is a disease that impacts people by its very nature and definition. That's what it does. It's not just your people though, your employees. It's anyone that also includes your third party and or supply chain, because there's people there too. Until we're fully automated through robots, and we're nowhere near that, we have a people dependency. And the pandemic strikes at the heart of that. So we have to really think about, as we roll out safety protocols, we're thinking workers' comp, we're thinking medical management, case management, absenteeism, sanitation in the workplace. All of that is part of your people and labor discussion. So if you look at the wheel to the right, it puts it all together. On the outside of the wheel, this is what we normally strive to achieve, no matter who we are, for-profit, not-for-profit, government and public entity, does not matter. We normally want to grow or grow with our population. We want to protect our brand. That's all about trust, right? We want to be a resilient enterprise, a resilient entity. That means it takes a lot to bring us to our knees. And then we also would like to hit our budget numbers, right? In summary, that's, if you will, a strategy in 4 points. In order to do that, you need people and labor. You have to manage risk, especially external risk, and manage through government, good, bad, or indifferent. Think about supply and demand and the economics thereof, and liquidity and cash flow. And the inner part of the wheel are the risks that disrupt you through the pandemic against those outer circles. So that's what we just covered when I talked through these 4 main pillars. So at Grant Thornton, we had a little bit of serendipity, or as my mom always said, favorable wind blow our way. And here's why. Because we have built pandemic models since about 2013, 2014, and we've mainly done them for insurance companies and financial institutions because they have regulations that require that they do them very specifically. And especially since 2008, they have to kind of think about these emerging and atypical risks when they report their risk profiles to regulators. So we built those and cut our teeth learning those and redoing those. And when COVID-19 went live, we quickly understood, similar to H1N1 and SARS, that we would need to understand the nature of the disease, and through our partnerships with public health institutions and with select universities, we're able to gather that data and very quickly learn from it and have them teach us. We then modify it through the risk model. And because this is not necessarily, we are not building a public health risk model, we are building a business impact risk model, which is why these 4 pillars are broken out the way they are. So we can take those public health data sets and translate them into a risk advisory conversation point for you. And then that allows us to begin to think about how this pandemic begins to work and impact you across these 4 areas and these sub-risk areas that we just covered in the wheel, so that you can begin to recover, right? Recover, plan your recovery, and prioritize your efforts and resources in a very nimble and focused way to march towards those goals. Next slide, please. So some people always say, well, don't we normally do that in our financial planning analysis and budget cycle conversations as we sort of fund it up for 2020? We probably did. You should have. But you weren't planning for a pandemic then. So the pandemic, by virtue of these 4 areas, really challenges you with some blind spots. So when you start talking people and labor, when you start talking supply and demand, and you start thinking about the need to prioritize your actions in these 4 sort of pandemic impact zones, what is it you're actually looking for in that money category, or that cash flow category, or that people category? What you're looking for is variance, right? So the idea is that you do not want one of these blind spots to catch you unawares, so that you don't keep your people safe, so that you open too early, have to close and reopen again, which is probably a sunk cost, if not for all, certainly many. So really balancing this across revenue and expense in its simplest form is a nice way to think about it. So let's talk expense first. We predicted early on, and so far we've been on point, that this pandemic had a blind spot involving surprise expenses. And they're not just your sanitation costs. They are things like your litigation costs. We have already seen substantial class action lawsuits as the result of COVID-19. Why? Because folks immediately canceled contracts and they turned off all of their bookings or closed up all their hotels or decided not to deliver goods and services as agreed and paid. So all of the contract law immediately went live. We saw that probably in the first 2 weeks. We saw lawsuits coming in, even though the lawyers weren't in the offices anymore. And the courts are closed. Did not matter. So when you think about litigation, you have to think about what might be coming at us by virtue of what we've done so far. You may not have been put on notice, but could you be? And if so, for what? Anticipate that. Plan for that. Suss that out a bit. It costs money, and certainly you want to mitigate the amount that you might be exposed to. And if you can do any remedial actions on that now, you certainly should. Another one, let's talk insurance. We are in a rapidly hardening, that is a term of art that means an insurance market that is becoming price adverse. In other words, premium prices are going up, and they're going up a lot. And if you haven't already experienced this or you're not involved in this part of the business, you'll have to take my word for it and go research it after this presentation. But they're going up a lot. Last year, they were up 10 to 13% on average across all lines of coverage. They'll be worse after COVID-19. Why? Workers' comp. Most states and departments of insurance have now said that your employees have a presumption of correctness if they allege they caught COVID-19 on the job. Now, interpret that into a work from home situation where somebody's spouse comes home and gives it to them, but they're working from home. But 2 weeks ago, they were sitting in one of your offices. Now, this probably is not the case at this point because there's been shelter in place for a long time. But I want you to roll it forward over the next 16 weeks because you're probably going to start letting some people go back into the office. Texas just reopened. So as you do that, if they go back and get sick, heads up. That's on you as an employer if they make a workers' comp claim against you. Now, a lot of employers thought, not a big deal. People are going to file this under their medical plan, especially if the federal government and or state governments, Medicaid, Medi-Cal, and others, right? Medi-Cal for California, Medicaid for all others, are going to cover the cost of this, and or private insurance is going to cover the cost of this. Debatable. And as a matter of fact, depending on what state you're in, there might be an enticement for your workers to file a workers' comp claim against you based upon your indemnification rates under workers' comp. Depends on what state you're in. So there's some nuances here that are worth a discussion. So this is the expense side of the equation as we think about net income and hitting, if you will, a financial target there. Let's talk about revenue. I already mentioned demand and supply. You have to be able to hit your revenue numbers. All right, what if your revenue number is a tax basis? Well, unemployment's not great right now, right? So when you start thinking about sales tax, or you start thinking about certain types of assessments for new boats or whatever, that might look substantially different in the future. So we have to think about that and really put some sensitivities around it because your revenue might change. Now, I was just on a call with a client whose revenue is getting better. Why? Because they're mostly an online institute. They do some professional certification work. And guess what? Why folks have been working from home, they figured now's as good a time as any to go get all of those professional certifications and annual requirements fulfilled that I need to do. Might as well just get to it. And because of all the new federal regulations, they have folks ordering materials from them that they are in the business of providing. So for them, while there's been some certain downside risk, there's been some nice upside risk. So it's not all bad news. It's really not all bad news. It's really just thinking about where those opportunities are on the revenue side. And if you're at risk of losing revenue, think about how you can pivot or reimagine something and maybe put a hedge against the revenue. There was another company we were talking to recently, and they're in the oil and gas business. And they have a very specialized type of technology that's used for a certain phase of the oil and gas business, and the only one in the world that does it. And my question to them was, is there anyone else who would be interested in that technology who's not in the oil and gas business? And they said, no. I said, well, what about Noah, right? And I don't mean from the Bible, Noah, Old Testament. I mean the Oceanic Institute, NOAA. And I mentioned to them, I said, what you've developed is a tech that, yes, it is used in oil and gas to do this purpose, but it also sounds awfully useful to what some of the folks in NOAA do a lot of research on, although it's not your core competency. Might they be interested? They had not even thought about it. And I'm not even an expert in it. It was just occurred to me because I'm in the risk profession and we follow NOAA, including some of these reports I just shared with you about hurricane season and floods. So that's the kind of opportunity where you can really think about ways to maybe change things up, maybe. And I know that's not possible for all of you, but it might be possible for some of you. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Now, before we get into this, I want to invite Andy into the conversation. He's got some tremendous information about the CARES Act, and you might have some questions about it as we go, as well as some tax implications that you're going to want to hear about that really can help with some of the cash flow that I was briefly touching on earlier. So Andy, let me turn it over to you for a bit.
Thank you, Yvette. So what I wanted to talk about is just some of the changes that Yvette has mentioned and how really when we look at the pandemic, how it's really not only just impacted the business, but really, its main focus is impacting employees. Not only is it just from a business perspective that your workers, maybe staying at home, being maybe less productive, but also what it brings, since this is a pandemic, it really brings a more personal viewpoint to all of your employees as they come to work, as they look at their neighbors, as they look at their coworkers, and it really kind of changes their perspective and what they expect from employers. So, when in our conversations with clients, I think we're still, as Yvette mentioned, still looking at different phases that companies are in. Meaning they're looking still at the kind of that respond and react to try to reduce, which really turns into looking at cash flow and how can they improve cash flow. And then the next phase that companies are talking about is really kind of building that resiliency as they look, in the short term and into the long term. And finally, what does, as Yvette mentioned, what does that whole rebuilding or restart, what does that look like down the road as work begins to change, your clients and suppliers begin to change, and how does that all interact then with your workforce? So first, as Yvette mentioned, let's talk a little bit about cash flow. I think one, with the immediate downturn, it's impacting most businesses, I should say. Some businesses are still doing just fine, but most businesses are impacted, some severely and some not so much. And so one of the ways that businesses are being supported is through the CARES Act. And what a lot of the different elements of the CARES Act is really trying to do is really help with employees. I mean, it's not just a business perspective, as the different terms and, whether it's the Paycheck Protection Program, the Employee Retention Credit, the payroll tax deferral, all these are really focused on keeping your employees in the workplace, still attached to the employer, to kind of maintain that relationship between the two. And so just to touch on a few elements, hopefully everybody is knowledgeable and has, if applicable, has applied for the payroll protection program. So I won't go into too much detail with that. But assuming that you have not, there are some other options that many employers are taking advantage of right now. The first of those are the payroll tax deferral, and that you're allowed as an employer to defer your employer portion of your Social Security that you're currently paying right now. You can basically stop paying and deposit 50% in 2021 and the remaining 50% in 2022. So again, this allows you to free up some immediate cash flow between March as well as through December 31 of this year and push that off into the 50% in the next 2 years. The other one that I'm having a lot of conversations about is the employee retention credit. And what this allows for is if, as an employer, you're paying your employees as you furlough them, so more of a pay leave where they're not performing services, then you can basically take a tax credit up to 50, and what that tax credit equals is 50% up to $10,000 in wages. And so what that can actually translate into is about $5,000 per employee. But again, assuming that you're over 100 employees, that's based on wages that you're providing to your employees for not providing services. But I think this is a good moment just to kind of stop. It's been kind of interesting, what we've seen over the last, few weeks as kind of, I'd say, as most of these programs have slowly become to be much more narrow. As we all know, when we look at the payroll protection program, how immediately a lot of larger employers went out and obtained their loans, and then there kind of became this uprising, where more people started complaining because those loans are really meant for the small businesses. And we saw a lot of more pressure that's being added to those companies to basically repay those loans back. And I'd say from that, as well as the support of the FAQs that continue to kind of narrow and chip away at who's eligible for those payroll protection program loans, it's also kind of moving that way into the employee retention credit as well. I will just add a couple of commentaries as one, and this is kind of new, hot off the press. There was an FAQ that was released yesterday in regards to the Paycheck Protection Program, and it made a big change that may impact some of the folks on the call today, and that is one, the whole 500 employee count. Most consultants out there have always kind of viewed that as just US employees. However, though, that 500 employee count also includes your international operations as well. So again, just to highlight how the new guidance that we're seeing that's being issued is kind of shrinking down or refocusing of who these programs are really meant for. And kind of with that too, then compare that to the employee retention credit. To be eligible for that retention credit, it's that you have a partial or fully business that's been impacted by a government order or shutdown. Now, what we've seen is just kind of a refining about that. I think, as you know, many businesses are impacted by the government shutdown. However, as many of the folks on the call today, you're all labeled as essential businesses. So really, that government order by the governor of Texas isn't directed straightly at you because you're an essential business. So what that is actually doing in a lot of situations is limiting whether or not this employee retention program is applicable to you. I think kind of with that, I just want to make a few comments of, with all the different companies that I've been speaking with in the medical device and the healthcare industry, kind of what are we seeing? I think as Yvette mentioned, everybody is still kind of quickly reacting. I think with the goal of taking this pandemic assessment is, again, to begin to have those discussions so that everyone can begin to think more logically and develop a plan of how to address some of these issues. And I think what I've seen in my conversations is there's a lot of companies that are reacting right now. I think if you look at certain industries like hospitality or especially the restaurants, they're in very much a reaction mode where they've straight out laid folks off. I think on the opposite are certain companies that are beginning to look of how do I maintain my employee base? Because in the end, once we begin to have our restart, begin that resiliency to have that rebirth and to get into that growth phase again, you still need your top performers. And how do you keep those around? And I think with that, we're seeing a lot more discussions about, okay, how do I use some of these government programs, which I just described, such as the employee retention, to help me kind of get there from a financial perspective? As well as we're seeing more companies that are beginning to really take a look at their employee base and planning it out of how do I keep attracting and retaining my top talent. Now, in some instances, for manufacturing, we're seeing a lot of hazard pay, whether it's increase in hours or annual bonuses, or we're seeing also, and another use is actually doing much more of a retention or a loyalty bonus, meaning have it kind of pay your employees now and kind of allow it that towards the end of the year when hopefully cash flow is a little better, that then you'd actually pay more of a loyalty bonus to hopefully true some of your employees up if they've been furloughed and or provide some additional monies in their pockets. And we're also seeing too, on the executive perspective, we're seeing a lot more of haircuts in pay. Definitely, we're seeing more additional of deferred compensation, meaning a lot of executives who are electing not to receive their compensation down the road, that they want to put it away into a non-qualified plan, in hopes that they can basically help with the cash flow issues that organizations are currently under. And I think just to kind of wrap it up a little bit, I think what we're seeing though is right now is really organizations trying to be, again, looking at how do they build resiliency with their workforce, as well as how do they continue to attract and retain those top performers, so that, again, as the rebuild starts happening, how do you still keep them engaged, motivated, so that your organization can continue to grow? So with that, I'll turn that back over to Yvette right now for the next slide.
Thanks. And so what you're looking at in front of you are the deliverables from our online survey tool, which is our Respond and Restore Resiliency Assessment. So by taking about 20 minutes of your time and answering a few questions for us, we can begin to build some scorecards for you, and this is free. Now, it's not going to be at the 5,000 foot level. It'll be at a 50 to 75,000 foot level. But we're going to ask you enough questions that we can help think about these pandemic impact zones, and on a scale of 1 to 5 and impacts to your working capital and your revenue, what are you looking at over the next 16 weeks? So we are looking forward, not back, forward, and really want to sort of recast with you opportunities that you can chase. And we believe at Grant Thornton that this accomplishes a couple of things for us, and hopefully for you. One is it gives us a chance to just have a deeper dialogue with you about what this pandemic means to your entity. And we might already be providing services for you in audit or tax, or perhaps already advisory. That doesn't matter. We didn't set this up for direct sales. We set this up because we thought it was the right thing to do. We have the tools, we have the people, we have the bench. And so really we view this as a differentiator for our firm. And because of the large amount of life science and healthcare and public entity clients that we have, among many others, we really thought this was a place for us to shine. And so when you complete the survey, it allows us to, within about 48 hours, generate a scorecard for you. And then we can set up a meeting and go over it together. And you can bring whoever you want to the meeting, and you can actually get whoever you want involved in the scorecard process. It is entirely up to you. There's a link, you just put in your email and you can pass it all around and everyone enters an email. And that makes sure we don't double count and we know sort of who told us what as we put all the numbers together. And then we basically push it through a pretty advanced forecasting model that allows us to really imagine the art of the possible for you as we look at those 4 impact zones. Then during the conversation, we explore a little bit differently, moving from generalities to specifics about areas that perhaps could be tightened up or maybe explored differently. And I gave you a few examples already. So that's really what we've done. And after this call, we can certainly share the link and the information. And you are welcome to explore as your time and calendar allows. And if you have any questions about it, we'd be happy to take them. This is a sample in front of you for people in labor. So again, you'd have a scale of 1 to 5, and then you'd have some context on here about where you might have some vulnerabilities or again, some opportunities that might give you a little bit of an aha moment. And again, because at this point, especially, we've done so many of these, we do have a pretty active amount of learning under our belt, right? Where we've sort of seen some things by this point, not just in the US, but even internationally. And we're happy to explore that with you, and our clients tend to find it incredibly valuable. And again, we view it as a way to really differentiate ourselves as your advisory, audit, and tax partner. Along the lines also of some of the things Andy just touched on, ways we can be helpful in very, very discrete strategies that you might be considering. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And I wanted to show kind of the reopen as of this morning. So this is probably one of the biggest questions we get, and it's a tough one. If I had a perfect crystal ball, if any of us had a perfect crystal ball, then maybe we wouldn't need these sort of day jobs, right? But we don't. And in the world of statistics, we work along lines of something called confidence intervals, which really deal with ranges of assurance, right? How right do we think we are? And especially in a pandemic, it's tough to say, oh, this is a 95% number, right? Or this is it's very, very difficult. But we are able to put together some pictures around what is more likely than not to happen. And it's what you're looking at here, and it's subject to some contingencies. So let's talk about what this all is. So first and foremost, let's look at the arrows at the bottom. So we had the initial lockdown that's been going on since approximately the 3rd week in March. We're rolling into about May 20th. We have some states already starting to slowly reopen in the US, but by May 20th, we're going to have most, if not all states, at least partially reopened beyond essential services. Then we're going to get on what we call the road to semi-normal, which is going to be this gradual sort of move along of folks thinking about those staffing models I referenced earlier, continuing to explore government funding options, really thinking about that customer supply and demand that I mentioned, right? And tuning across all of it. But there's something coming in the fall. But let's hit the pause button on that for a moment and focus for the first part only on the curves to the left, and let's go up from those bottom arrows and look at those curves. We have broken the US into 4 regions. We have all of the US, which is in blue, which is the outermost curve or the highest mountain peak that you're looking at. Right beneath that is going to be the green curve, which is the East Coast, not surprisingly. And then we drop down to Midwestern and Central, which is the purple. And next to the bottom, and then right beneath that is West Coast, right? And that's like kind of an orangey yellow lowest line on this. Now, we update this daily, and we're looking at all of the reporting, even including the time delay of reporting and other sort of noisy elements of reporting in the US. We're looking at all that down to the county level. We're then casting, and it's like fly fishing, right? We're like kind of casting that line out and looking at what does this all mean in terms of what's happening, I should say what's happened, what's happening, and what is most likely to happen. But we need to apply the good stuff that could also be coming along with us. So what's the good stuff? Well, the good stuff is some of the stuff Pat talked about, right? We've got some clinical trials going on. And in the US and abroad, we're learning and we're making progress. The University of Washington has a large one going. Johnson & Johnson has kicked off theirs in the US. And as you mentioned, there's some in other countries. And there's some little ones that are sort of subtextual to that are also going. So you'll see the antiviral trial results are marked for April 20th. We started actively tracking that as a risk mitigant that's going to help bring us down the sort of backside of the mountain here. Also, we have testing capacity increasing daily. That matters when you hunt a big enemy like a virus. You have got to know where the invisible enemy lurks. As we know in public health, it is so important to test, trace, and contain, especially to mitigate community spread. So the more we're doing of that, the better we will get at containment. It's going to take us further down the slope of this mountain. Now, we also have serology testing. That's antibody testing, right? That's blood work, and it's had its issues. We actually pushed the state out because of it. But this is really the idea of understanding who's already been infected. And you might have already read about COVID toes and things like this, even beyond serology testing, that are allowing us to understand very quickly in an incidental exam whether or not somebody has had COVID. Then we're trying to very quickly understand, can you be reinfected again? By the way, the answer is yes, and still standing is yes. And can you be infected with more than one strain at a time? And that answer is also currently standing as yes. But what we're learning is that the severity of that second infection may not be as bad in that same reinfected person. We are seeing that. We're still concerned about viral shedding and some other things, but we're putting all this together, and we can now just, again, kind of go down the downside of the mountain. What we're marching towards are healthcare workers in a much more protected state, and perhaps in an early vaccinated state or some modicum thereof, right? It may not be a perfect vaccine, but it starts to look something like a flu vaccine at a minimum. And then we get the general public back to work as well. And that is like around July 20th, where we have sort of full reopen at that point, subject to whatever an employer wants to do. Right, so that's at an employer's choice, if you will, versus at being a mandatory or guided choice by state, county, or city. And so as we move to the right, what we're really getting to is the thing you need to pay the most attention to. And that is, as you think across these 4 pandemic impact zones, what's going to happen in the fall, right? And there's going to be a phase 2 in the absence of a perfect vaccine, which means you must prepare now. And we must not have a redo for all intents and purposes of what we just went through. So that means that agility, timeliness, use of technology, staffing optimization models are going to be critical considerations in your 4 talking points that I highlighted at the start of this presentation. So with that, I want to allow some time for question. We can always follow up with additional Q&A later, but I see that we have about 5 minutes left, and wanted to certainly, Jackie, take some if appropriate. And Pat, I think you had maybe one more slide after this as well. My apologies.
No, no worries. Yeah, we'll leave this up during questions. I don't know if there are any questions. It looks like there's one. Let me see if I can read it. If loyalty bonus is paid during the 8 weeks after receiving PPP funding, can that amount? And unfortunately, it's hard for me to read the rest of the question.
I think we know the answer. Andy, we know the answer. Yeah. Are you there, Andy? If not, I'll take the answer, but I know Andy knows this. He might be on mute.
He's off mute now. Andy?
Yes, I'm here. No, go ahead, Yvette. I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, so in the definition of the PPP, it does clearly delineate that bonuses are covered as part of that. So as you look at that requirement that you have for the minimum threshold that has to go towards payroll, that is in the payroll calculation. So that's a good thing. So it goes towards your, if you will, your threshold that you need to meet in order to qualify for loan forgiveness, which I'm guessing is the impetus for your question, is you want to make sure that you hit the appropriate targets for loan forgiveness.
I think, Yvette, what I'd also like to add is, as in our discussions, especially on the manufacturing side, is that, because this is so personal with employees, is that we're seeing that these bonuses or extra hourly rates are pretty much required, as you're trying to make sure that your workers show up to work in the factories. So as I think as things begin to open up and there's, additional health risks, I think that's becoming much more common that we're seeing kind of across the board, as well as I think just due to the overall financial stress that many of your employees may be experiencing, that there is the whole culture side of it too, to try to support your employees too in kind of this time of hardship.
Yeah, good point. Any other questions?
Well, there was one question about being able to get a copy of the deck, and yes, they will be available. And I'll work with Jackie to figure out how to get that. Lisa, I know that you haven't had a chance to comment. Are there any thoughts that we've missed that you wanted to bring up?
Thanks, Pat. The only thing that I'd like to mention is the survey, that the link's right there in the presentation. We have put an industry spin on it. So if you choose to take the survey, which we hope you do participate, and when you go to the landing page, you will see that there's a question around industry, and life sciences is available now.
Great. And there's also other industries, I think banking and insurance as well, that are up on the website. And I wanted to remind everyone, there's no charge for this. So this is at the very least an excellent opportunity to see the questions that need to be asked by yourselves, and that would inform your checklist. But you're happy to take advantage of scheduling a conversation with us as well. With that, Jackie, I think we've covered everything. With a minute to spare, is there anything that you wanted to close with?
Hi, Pat. We have a couple more questions here in the queue. Did you want to address those? I know we're out of time, or we can direct some of those questions to you all after this is concluded.
We can try to answer them in the short amount of time we have left. Do you want to read them off, please?
Sure. So we have one that is asking, why are new cases expected to flatten after May 20th without a vaccine and with more individuals returning to work?
The primary region that's at risk right now is the Central Midwest. And We think that it's continuing to phase about 2 weeks behind, 2 to 2.5 weeks behind New York City's pace. In some cases, in some states, it's a bit elongated. That's on average. And so we're going to have a couple of things happen at one time. We're going to see the East Coast go down that mountainside, and we're going to see the Midwest continue to compress up. And then we're going to see the East Coast start to go into phase 2, right? As the Midwest starts to dip down, using that as an analogy in central region. And then we're going to have East Coast come down again and Midwest go back up. So think of it as sort of an ocean, right? Or the mountains I've shown with things going up and down. But right now, the hot zone, and I don't mean that, I know in El Paso it's hot right now, but really that central to Midwest region, the cases are exploding here. It's really accelerating quickly.
Okay, thank you. And then this last question we can just address quickly. It says a question related to employee exposure at work, workers' comp. If employers are following CDC guidelines, providing PPE, etc., and an employee still gets infected, is it possible to track that back to the place of employment? Is place of contracting possible?
So again, most state labor codes, including Texas's, are very much geared to the benefit of the employee. Now, it's intentional. That's just how workers' comp law has been since 1918 when it was created, right? And so the answer is, if your employee makes an allegation that they caught COVID-19 at work, and there's no other reason to think that they may have caught it anywhere else, and that's going to be especially true if you've had an instance at your location, it's going to be tough to disprove that. Now, if their spouse has it, that's a different story, right? But what we've clearly seen is instances where there's been any hint of it in an employment location. The case law so far from workers' compensation and the designation from the Departments of Insurance in the US, it seems to be very, very clear to us on what the point is.
Okay, and if you don't mind, I have one quick question for you all. So have you done any analysis, since we are a border region, and what the United States does is not in a vacuum. So we are also concerned about how Mexico is responding to this. Have you all done any analysis on border regions and how we respond might be different from the rest of the country?
Yes, but with a slight twist on your question. So we look at COVID-19 in every country, and we track that daily. And we certainly have paid attention to Central Mexico and Central America, right? And including the movement and the growth of the virus in that region. But not in a border region sliver, if you will, Jackie. So we're thinking about it more in terms of contagion risk as transit opens up between countries, whether that is by land, by sea, or by air.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that wraps up the Q&A portion of the webinar. I don't know if you all have any closing comments, but from our side, from the MCA and BioAll Paso-Juarez, we are very, very thankful for your all's presentation. I found it to be extremely informative and interesting and helpful, and hopefully everybody on the call did as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. It was a pleasure. We appreciate the opportunity to share our work in this area.
Thank you so much, and I encourage all of the listeners to check out the survey and complete it and see if you can benefit from continued guidance from Grant Thornton on these issues.
Jackie, we sent the PDF version of the deck to you. Do you want to be sending it out to those who responded? Does that make sense?
Yes, we will send it out to all of those who were on the call today. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Grant Thornton team, for joining us and for your participation. And thank you to everybody on the line. We hope that everybody stays healthy and safe, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.